Alaikum. Thank you, Khurram. Thank you, Khakan, for turning up. Actually, we're going to start this webinar. This is the PIDE. My name is Nadeem ul Haq. Khurram Hussain. Everybody knows Khurram Hussain. He's a very popular columnist. He also heads the Prophet magazine, which is one of Pakistan's most successful business magazines, and has established himself very well as a very well-known economist in the country. So, I'm happy to have both of them here. So let me begin by just giving you a very short, I'm sure all of you have seen our paper, but let's begin with a very short presentation by Waqar Ahmed, one of the authors of the paper. Waqar Saab, would you like to do a short presentation? Then we'll go for the discussion.
Let me start by some basic facts of our economy. Just remind that our long-term growth is declining, which is very critical for us to keep in mind while having this discussion. And the second thing is that the both key drivers of growth are also having a long-term declining trend. Both investment and total factor productivity are declining over the time in Pakistan. So these are the just two or three key factors that we should keep in mind. And now, if we come to the IMF program, especially the 7th and 8th review reports, which happened on September. PIDE notes that we should, the IMF program as well, should focus on growth because Pakistan needs a sustainable growth rate of around 8% over a long period. However, the review report shows that the economy of Pakistan starts overheating at a growth rate of around 6%. And PIDE notes that the primary reason of this overheating is basically substantial regulatory and productivity constraints. I present here just one example. Just look at the government footprint. PIDE estimated that the government footprint in the form of regulations, public sector enterprises, and general government spendings is more than 80% of the GDP. So our government is having a huge footprint in the economy. And the second point, the review report also suggests that the state bank will continue a tight monetary policy to restrain the higher inflation expectations. If we go through the review report, you can find that the state bank and IMF agreed that a tight monetary policy unless they achieve a positive real interest rate. However, PIDE notes that the real interest rate would remain negative during the program period. And if we consider that if we have to take the real interest rate positive territory, then it implies that the nominal interest rate would be higher than 25% or even more. So it would be a challenging environment for the state bank to contain inflation through monetary measures. The primary reason which PIDE notes that is that the current wave of inflation is because of supply side shocks instead of demand side shocks. PIDE estimates suggest that the supply side pressure contribute around 80% of current wave of inflations. And we agree with IMF that all concessionary interest rates should be eliminated to ensure that the policy rate has the teeth. But unfortunately, we don't see the program recommending a time path or a framework to achieve this goal. So we wish to have something on how to achieve this, how to eliminate these concessionary interest rates. And if we go through further on the review report, you can see that the review report also encouraging the developmental financial institutions. But we know that in Pakistan's crony environment, these development financial institutions, instead of boosting industrialization, they created an environment of subsidies and rent seeking. And we have to close several of these development financial institutions with huge losses to the government. So we have to be very careful about this thing as well. And if we have a look on the fiscal measures and especially on the taxation side, what we find that the review report has not addressed the structural issues of taxation in Pakistan. And the proposed measures in the report make the taxation more complex. What PIDE is suggesting that we should rationalize the withholding taxation And we should increase the general sales tax coverages and focus on point of sale integration, which is still incomplete. And the most critical thing is that we have to treat all the incomes as a universal. For example, in case of Pakistan, agriculture income is still non-taxable. So we should introduce universal income tax and eliminate this filer and non-filers distinctions, which is creating a lot of problems. Furthermore, the program does not stress on the expenditure reforms and focused only on the tax revenue side. We are suggesting here is that we should have also consolidate on our expenditure side as well. We have to close down inefficient public agencies with zero-based budgeting, and we have to limit the ministries and unions. And especially, we have to focus on how to establish a new agencies. We limit setting up new agencies, and new agencies to be set up only after proper costing and open parliamentary approvals. And we have also recommended some pension reforms as well. Now, if you look at the contingent liabilities, which is a huge empty hole in the fiscal management, and review report has not considered this aspect as well. And these contingent liabilities are putting an unwanted pressure on the fiscal resources. And review report has also recommended the implementation of Treasury single accounts too. However, we observed that the Treasury single account one has not been fully implemented due to many bottlenecks and resistance, especially from bureaucracy. And what PIDE is suggesting that we have to address the capacity issues in order to have an effective implementation of Treasury single accounts management. And for that, we have to revamp our civil services. Now, if we look at the debt profiling, then the review report is projecting that the current account deficit would be around 3% of GDP. And review report also projecting an increase in the external inflow. However, PIDE notes that extracting external inflow without adopting structural reforms would be a daunting task for the government, as we are seeing it now. What PIDE is suggesting is that establishment of independent debt management office, and this debt management office can be found by merging the national saving accounts and debt management functions of Ministry of Finance and state banks. And this proposed debt management office could able to bring the savings into formal channels by introducing different instruments in the market. Once again, state-owned enterprises reform has been highlighted in the review report, and different methods have been discussed, and some of them also mentioned in the review report. What PIDE is suggesting is that we need an autonomy. The state-owned enterprises need autonomy with accountability, which cannot happen if the practice of taking all decisions by the ministries and central level without transparencies remain in place. The autonomy of state-owned enterprises can only be achieved by empowering the boards of the managers instead of secretaries and ministers. So we have to take away the board's management from ministries and secretaries. And for that, we also have to develop our local expertise instead of relying on the technical assistance from international development partners. The one key aspect that the review report ignored according to PIDE's initial review is the regulatory issues. Our economy is heavily regulated, and these regulations are bearing huge economic losses and are constraining our investment. The one best example is the PEPRA system, which we have introduced on the urge of World Bank, and officials feels that it causes huge time delays and increased cost in public procurement processes. Discussion between Auditor General and PIDE has also confirmed that there are many inefficiencies caused by this PEPRA system. So we also have to rethink about these regulations that are in place. And now, if we look at the review report, there is a stress on the corruption and how to address this corruption issue. What we at PIDE are feeling that this corruption mantra actually are hurting our investment climate, and we have to focus on transparency. And although both transparency and accountability go hand in hand, but we are too much focused on accountability. But we have to focus on transparency first, and that will also help us to have some climate, investment climate, improve investment climate. Now, if we talk about the financial sector reforms, there is not much in the review report. PIDE notes that we have to consider the financial sector reforms as well. For example, just look at the entry in the banking sector, which is virtually prohibited, and there are very few players in the financial markets, and non-banking financial institutions are also severely limited, and banking spread is larger than in the nationalized days. And review report is also reaffirming the commitment towards the open economy, and we agree with them. But we should also note that in the last 3 programs, we have increased tariff, regulatory duties, and other surcharges, which is actually a reversal of the openness. Besides this, we have also recently seen a massive controls on current account transactions. And for that, PIDE is suggesting that we need to develop a clear rules and guideline to set a time path to the open economy. Now, if we talk about the balance of payment, the IMF projections in 7th and 8th review report are showing that our current account deficit will fall, and by 47%, and the state bank will follow the market-based exchange rate. Now, the question that we should ask to ourselves is that what will be the real effective exchange rate, given that we have placed different surcharges, tariff rates, and excise duties. What PIDE is suggesting that we are agreeing with the IMF that we should focus on market-based exchange rate, and the state bank should not intervene in the exchange rate market. And instead of focusing on exchange parity, state bank should focus on building its foreign reserves. And the energy sector, which is quite bleeding sector in the Pakistan, circular debt is the key issue, as we all know. What PIDE is suggesting that the decentralization and management overall is the only solution, but unfortunately, IMF sees that the increasing the energy tariffs is the solution. What we are saying that is the increasing the energy tariff is not the solution; it's the decentralization is the solution. So we have corporatized discourse, but only in paper. It is unclear under which law the discourse are governed. Over the years, instead of decentralization, the government footprints on the sector has become more significant. PIDE is again suggesting independent boards for these discourse without any bureaucratic influence, and decentralized billing system with prepaid smart meterings, and an elimination of uniform tariff structures. This is the most important recommendation by the PIDE, because there will be no competition when we account inefficient and efficient discourse as one, and charging the consumers against uniform tariffs. So we are suggesting that we should eliminate this uniform tariff system. Again, in energy sector, we need some planning coordinations. PIDE is suggesting a moratorium on the IPPs and an audit of the existing contract. And we also have to develop an electricity market, and the starting point would be bilateral contract and allowing wheeling and bilateral contract. And lastly, the social protection has also been highlighted in the review report. But the social protection has become a political instrument, and it is an expanding agenda. And currently, if we look at the review report, the expenditure stands around rupees 316 billions. PIDE notes that the BISP has already covered people far more than ultra poor, and so we have to rethink. And there are multiple protection initiatives. Provincial governments are also running their own social protections as well as the federal governments. So the point to ponder upon is that what are the main objectives of these social protections? It is not clear what are the objective of these social protection. Is it just precursors of universal basic incomes, or, and secondly, do we have the fiscal resources to continue these social protections? So this is all of PIDE commentary. Now, if we look at the recent developments that happened over 2 months, IMF is demanding a mini budget from the government due to 3 reasons. The first is our revenue shortfall. The recent projections of IMF, as we are hearing from different news, is around 400 to 500 billions from tax revenue, while the non-tax revenue shortfall is around 300 to 350 billions. So the government is facing a revenue shortfall. Same way, we were expecting that the remittance inflow will continue an increasing trend, and that will help us to service our debt. But the recent decline in remittances is also alarming, and debt servicing is also becoming an issue for the government. And the third key issue is the government expenditures, and that's why IMF is also asking justification for the government why they are continue with energy tariff, subsidized energy and gas tariffs to export-oriented industries and Kisan packages and so on. So they have revised the projections for the government. Previously, the budget deficit was 4.7% of GDP. Now it's around 6%. Primary deficit again revised upward to 2.8% of GDP, and GDP growth slashed down to 2% of GDP only, while the inflation was expected to remain 23% to 25% of GDP. So these are the recent developments, and with this, I hope we will have a good discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So the upshot is that the IMF program may be overly focused on demand management and little structural reform content. And that overly focus on demand management is also forcing to a lot of governance issues, probably, and not probably, but in fact, austerity, which leads to further inefficiency. And the structural issues are totally ignored, and the structural issues keep multiplying, and we keep trying to tax them or price them out. At the same time, we are focusing on reducing openness of the economy, reducing the competitiveness of the economy. So the program design is a serious issue that I invite all academia and commentators to think about and talk about. So with that, let me turn over to Hakan. Would you like to go first?
Thank you, Dr. Saab, for inviting me. And it's great to see PIDE doing all this work under your guidance. And it's a pleasure to be with you. So let me start. देखें, मसला आपने बहुत अच्छी तरह सामने रखा है. वो ये है कि पाकिस्तान के इश्यूज जो हैं वो स्ट्रक्चरल हैं, और हमारा जो एक क्रॉनिक जैसे ही ग्रोथ होती है वो हमारा एक बीओपी क्राइसिस हो जाता है, जो एक आई थिंक एक प्रॉक्सिमेट कॉज है. एंड एज आई गो अलोंग वील टॉक अबाउट दिस. और हमारा जो QFD है, जिसको आप कॉज है फिस्कल डेफिसिट है, वो तो स्ट्रक्चरल की वजह से क्रिएट हो रहा है. उसका कोई हल जो है वो स्ट्रक्चरल में ही लाई करता है. आपने भी ये बात की, करेक्ट. बट हो ये रहा है कि बहुत अरसे से वी कीप गोइंग टू द सेम डॉक्टर व्हिच ट्रीट्स अस विद सिम्प्टोमैटिक ट्रीटमेंट. And I'm going to use this word partly, and I want audience to remember this word, which is partly by IMF, because my view here is a bit different than this generic thinking that we've always been in an IMF program. The diagnostic surgical treatment, जिसकी ज़रूरत है, जो डॉक्टर साहब कहते रहते हैं, obviously वो remains largely a miss. इस प्रोग्राम को a good review has been presented. मैं भी कुछ चीजें आपके सामने रखूंगा, and we'll get a better idea. But we cannot absolve IMF. IMF is not any ordinary institutions. It does an Article 4 for the whole world. It does regional comparisons, global comparisons. Pakistan ने बहुत सी technical assistance भी ली है IMF से. State Bank of Pakistan में, FPR में, जिस डेट ऑफिस का आपने जिक्र किया वहां पर भी. So it's not कि हमारी engagement जो है कोई light रही है इस sense में, और lending to member countries, you understand. जो एक सेट पैटर्न है, अगर हम उस पे रहें तो ऑब्वियसली बैलेंसिंग बजट्स, रिमूविंग सब्सिडीज, बिकॉज ये हैं वो चीजें दो जो ब्लीडिंग क्रिएट कर रही हैं. सो आई एम गोइंग टू यूज अ लॉट ऑफ मेडिकल एनालॉजीज. डॉक्टर साहब नोज माय फादर इज अ कार्डियोलॉजिस्ट. सो द ब्लीडिंग needs to be stopped. We go to the IMF, we stop that bleeding in the ICU, but then the general ward treatment and the surgical treatment remains a miss. This is the whole hypothesis जिस पे मैं build करूंगा आज की talk आपके साथ. Privatization, liberalizing trade, removing restrictions on capital flows और फिर bailout. अब 2016 का program डॉक्टर साहब was also there, so I was very deeply involved with it. This is what I've learned. और आज maybe part of this is missing. Again, astute management of the program has to be done by the country. If you want to run a smooth program, you need a professional team. You need to be able to frame your own MEFP. I remember sitting on the 6th floor of the Cube block, writing that MEFP before we went, writing it with the privatization team, with the energy team, and with all the other teams. Doing the regular flows so that we, the follow-ups made sure that we stayed quite current with what was going on. Design of the program. और अभी हम आएंगे कि ये जो डिजाइन बहुत अच्छा पाइड ने अभी सामने रखा कि क्या है, इसमें क्या किया जा सकता है, आज भी क्या किया जा सकता है to sail through this program. देखिए, cost of adjustments तो होगी. अब what you want to make sure is it communally felt and it doesn't erode the capacity of the government to do two things. One, what I've always said, IMF plus. For example, IMF plus 2016 में क्या था? वो ये था कि आप सारे energy लगा रहे थे. We kept on doing that. CPEC जैसे भी चल रहा था, वो चलता रहा. So, there is an IMF plus. This time, there is no IMF plus that is going on. Lastly, completing an IMF program, my understanding has always been, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for prosperity. I mean, this is something we have to remember very, very thoroughly. And Pakistan seems to have missed on this account. देखिए, जिस तरह economy wire हो गई है, because ये कोई productive endogenous productivity पे तो grow कर नहीं रही है. So obviously you run into a chronic BOP crisis. But जो सबसे बड़ी बात है, and I've written on this a lot, Pakistan is in a perpetual dollar liquidity crunch. आज, this is largely exasperated because there are inordinate delays in doing the reviews, as you saw last time. Even now, 3rd November was the date to do the review. We are still in a delay. The political uncertainty and the floods. $31 अरब आपको चाहिए. IMF is your anchor to make sure you don't become Sri Lanka. That is how I view the program. That is how I view our engagement with the program currently. इसका रिजल्ट आपके सामने. पाकिस्तान का क्रेडिट डिफॉल्ट स्वैप कल जब मैंने चेक किया, मैं कुछ फंड्स के साथ काम करता हूं, वो तकरीबन 5700 पे था, if I remember correctly, और श्रीलंका का क्रेडिट डिफॉल्ट स्वैप भी तकरीबन 5600 पे था. So you can imagine where bond yields is very well known, एक जिट्रिनस FX मार्केट्स में है. So markets जो हैं वो काम नहीं हुई हैं, even us being in the program. Now that for me is a concerning aspect. एक अनप्लीजिंग सेट ऑफ डेटा था जब जून में हमने ये प्रोग्राम किया. अब जरा अपने नंबर देखें, ये भी मुझे डिस्कम्फर्ट है. डिस्कम्फर्ट क्यों है? एटलीस्ट ये नंबर ये नहीं होने चाहिए थे बीइंग इन द फंड प्रोग्राम. $8 बिलियन के अराउंड आपके रिजर्व्स चल रहे हैं. आप 5280 का 8% के करीब का फिस्कल कर रहे हैं. आप 17.5 अरब का कैड कर रहे हैं. और डॉक्टर साहब और मेरे जो फेवरेट बाकी चीजें हैं, क्वाज़ी फिस्कल डेफिसिट, वो नीचे मैंने लिखा है 2500 1500 फूड का. आई डोंट नो इफ डॉक्टर साहब नोज. आई होप ही कैन एनलाइटन अस. प्रोग्राम क्या है? वो वही है जो आपने बताया. एक्सचेंज रेट, रैशनलाइजेशन ऑफ सब्सिडीज. PDL से I have not agreed with the PDL, so this is my thinking. I think PDL at 50 rupees. When we set PDL, and I was one of the people who wrote PDL, this was always when you have a falling fuel prices, you come in with PDL, and because ये उस pool में नहीं जाता जो पैसे पूरी provinces को जाते हैं, so you make money for the center. Because NFC की वजह से पैसे center के बहुत कम रह गए थे, तो हमने सेल्स टैक्स को कम किया और पीडीएल लगाया. बट इसका मतलब ये नहीं था कि एक हाईली इन्फ्लेशनरी एनवायरनमेंट में भी हम पीडीएल को उसी तरह रन करें. 3% का फिस्कल है, 7.9 से 4.9 की करेक्शन. आई डोंट थिंक दिस इज गोइंग टू हैपन. एंड आई थिंक यहाँ पे जून 2022 में जब प्रोग्राम निगोशिएट हुआ तो हमें सोचना चाहिए. अब टैक्स की बहुत अच्छी बात की है. टैक्स मेरा ख्याल है कि इस वक्त तक इस प्रोग्राम में 750 के मेजर्स लगे थे जब मैं मई 19 में था टेबल पे, उसके बाद भी लगते रहे. बट अगेन द रियल वीकनेस इज ऑन आवर एडमिनिस्ट्रेटिव साइड. सो The bulk of the focus goes on the policy side, where the bulk of the weakness, the structural weakness, is on our digitization, automation, and all the other things that we want to do. And then the new taxes, whether that's agri or on the real estate, they remains a mess. अब एक्सपेंडिचर साइड बहुत अच्छी बात की अहमद ने, बहुत ही ल्यूक वार्म रिस्पॉन्स है. आई मीन पेंशन्स पे कुछ नहीं है, सो आई वुड हैव पुट पेंशन्स. I don't want to overload a program because then it's hard to fulfill, but not doing pensions at this stage and running a 500 billion pensions ka expenditure, I don't think that's justified. इन्वेस्टमेंट 14.5% से ऊपर चली जाएगी. लास्ट ईयर 13.2% थी. आई अगेन डोंट सी दैट हैपनिंग एज वेल. सो आई थिंक ये भी रीडिजाइन करने की जरूरत है. डेट ऑफिस, ये रूटीन मेजर्स हैं. इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम, देयर इज अ रीजन आई हियर डिफर विद अ लॉट ऑफ पीपल. द रीजन आई लाइक इनकम सपोर्ट प्रोग्राम इज that it has given us a data of 9 million households who we can reach. We reached in COVID, we can reach now. So at least a very sound database has been created. I mean, one would tend to agree कि आप लोगों को पैसे देने की बजाय हुनर सिखाएं, वो एक फर्क लेवल की गुफ्तगू है. But I tend to agree, and funds being good. हमने 17 अरब से ये शुरू किया था प्रोग्राम, जिसको आप एहसास कहें, बेनजीर इनकम सपोर्ट कहें. आज आई थिंक 350 पे है. फंड के होते हुए भी हम ये करते रहे, एंड एटलीस्ट वी आर रीचिंग सम पीपल. एनर्जी क्रिटिकल है. सर्कुलर डेट मैनेजमेंट प्रोग्राम 2014 में लिखा गया था. मुझे याद है, कुछ लोग अभी आई थिंक इस वक्त मौजूद हैं, जरगम सुन रहे हैं, इन्होंने हमारे साथ बैठ के लिखा था. आज भी उसी की फाइनेंशियल इंजीनियरिंग हो रही है. वो क्या है कि हम पीपीपी रीनिगोशिएट कर लें, हम अपने डेट को मूव कर लें फ्रॉम पीएचपीएल में हमारे 800-900 अरब रुपए पार्क दें, एक चीपर प्राइवेटाइजेशन ऑफ डिस्कोर्स की बजाय एक प्राइवेट पार्टिसिपेशन कर लें. आई डोंट थिंक दैट्स गोइंग टू वर्क. आई मीन, इफ यू आस्क मी, आई इन्वेस्ट विद दीज फंड्स, दे आर कॉल्ड डिसरप्शन फंड्स. दे इन्वेस्ट इन डिसरप्टिव टेक्नोलॉजीज. जब तक आप एनर्जी सेक्टर में डिसरप्टिव काम नहीं करेंगे, पाकिस्तान का एनर्जी सेक्टर मुझे तो ठीक होता हुआ दिखाई नहीं दे रहा. 700 अरब इस वक्त पीएसओ करता है, एंड आई मीन वी आर इन डिस्ट्रेस. डाइवेस्टमेंट बहुत माइनर बैंक्स की है, कब से चली आ रही है, फर्स्ट वुमेन बैंक की. हियर लेट द प्रोग्राम डू व्हाट इट्स डूइंग, बट डू द हरक्यूलियन एफर्ट. कौन रोक रहा है आपको कि कोई बड़ी एलएनजी की ट्रांजैक्शन ना करें? 2019 से हिज रॉयल हाइनेस से सऊदी अरेबिया से करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, कतर से करने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं. सो नाउ आई वांट यू टू थिंक लाइक दिस. दिस इज द आईएमएफ प्रोग्राम. उसमें हम कुछ चीजें बेहतर करने की गुफ्तगू कर रहे हैं, बट हम करना क्या चाहते हैं? हम एक IMF प्लस करना चाहते हैं, जो हमें साथ साथ करना चाहिए. That even remains a miss. और थर्ड जो डिग्री है वो है आपके स्ट्रक्चरल काम की, वो तो बिल्कुल ही remains a miss. So this is where we are operating. कॉर्पोरेट गवर्नेंस रूल 2013 में मैंने पाकिस्तान के लिए लिखे, इसलिए लिखे कि कोई एसओईज को मैनेज किया जा सके. वो 2016 में अपग्रेड हुए. अब हम चाहते हैं कि हम एक नया लॉ बना दें. मैं तब भी कहता था कि ये कंपनीज ऑर्डिनेंस के अंडर कंपनीज चलती हैं, ये सरकार में इसलिए नहीं चलती कि हमारी डिसीजन मेकिंग जो है वो वीक रहती है. इसके अलावा इसका मतलब बाकी चीजें, बट हमने फिर एसओई लॉ दे दिया है कि हम एक एसओई लॉ बनाएंगे. उस लॉ में आप देखेंगे अभी भी वो अप्रूव नहीं हो सका, एंड आई एम होपिंग कि वो अप्रूव करा लेंगे. एंटी करप्शन, सही बात की, आई एम नॉट गोइंग टू डू इट. अब एक चीज याद रखिए कि इस मैक्रो एनवायरनमेंट को भी आईएमएफ कंट्रोल कर रहा है. वो कैसे कर रहा है? देयर इज अ फ्लोर ऑन द नेट इंटरनेशनल रिजर्व्स, एसबीपी सीलिंग ऑन एनडीए, एंड ये टेक्निकल बातें हैं, बट इसको भी बगौर देख रहा है. आईएमएफ का प्रोग्राम जो है वो एक बड़ा होलिस्टिकली चल रहा होता है एमईएफपी को लेके. प्रायर एक्शंस, क्वांटिटेटिव परफॉर्मेंस क्राइटेरिया, इंडिकेटिव टारगेट्स और स्ट्रक्चरल बेंचमार्क्स. अब हमने ये तो बात कर ली कि हम कुछ बेहतरी कैसे कर सकते हैं, बट पाकिस्तान इज इन अ वेरी वेरी डिस्कम्फर्टिंग पोजीशन. ये मैं क्यों कहता हूँ? ये मैं इसलिए कहता हूँ कि जब फ्लड्स हुए तो सही अहमद ने भी कुछ चीजों का जिक्र किया. अब पाकिस्तान को इस वक्त क्रेडिबिलिटी क्रिएट करने के लिए क्या करना चाहिए? Being in the fund program, please present a macro and fiscal framework. अपना मैक्रो और फिस्कल फ्रेमवर्क सामने रखिए. वो बेस्ड हो उस मैक्रो मॉडलिंग पे जो हमने बहुत कोशिश की कि फाइनेंस में भी बने, प्लानिंग में भी बने, स्टेट बैंक के पास वो मौजूद है कि आपका फिस्कल फ्रेमवर्क है क्या. आप अगर 3.5% जब फंड कह रहा था तो आप 5% कह रहे थे, आप 11.5% की इन्फ्लेशन लेके चले थे. ये सारे नंबर्स आउट हो गए हैं. मार्केट्स की जिटरीनेस होने की बड़ी वजह जो है वो ये है कि आपका मैक्रो फ्रेमवर्क सामने नहीं आ रहा, आपके मैक्रो फ्रेमवर्क के मेजर नंबर्स सामने नहीं आ रहे. ये पाकिस्तान को सामने रखने हैं. फिर आप जाके फंड से बेशक डिस्कस करें ये सारी चीजें जो है ऑफ कोर्स फ्लड से भी तब्दील हुई हैं, कुछ ग्लोबल इंपैक्ट है। आप 36 अरब डॉलर की एक्सपोर्ट लेके चलें, हाईली अनलाइकली है कि आप 36 अरब डॉलर की एक्सपोर्ट करेंगे। एक्सपोर्ट ग्रोथ इसलिए भी रुक गई है बिकॉज ग्लोबल एनवायरनमेंट तब्दील हो गई है। सो दैट इज द फर्स्ट थिंग टुडे पाकिस्तान शुड डू। आपने एक एग्री पैकेज रखा है, आपकी एक शॉर्टफॉल पीडीएल में आ रही है, आपने सब्सिडी एक्सपोर्टर्स को दी है, आपने एसओई लॉ करना है, टैक्स टू जीडीपी में भी आपको ये जो फंड पैसे मांग रहा है ये इसलिए मांग रहा है कि जो आपकी रीबेसिंग हो गई है जीडीपी की, क्योंकि आप अब आपका जो नॉमिनल ग्रोथ है वो बहुत ज्यादा आ रही है, डिनोमिनेटर बहुत बढ़ गया है। तो अगर आप 7,400 भी कलेक्ट करते हैं, जो कि मेरा नहीं ख्याल कि आप एफपीआर पे करेंगे, तो आपका जो टैक्स टू जीडीपी और एफपीआर है वो गिर जाएगा। देखिए याद रखिए, फंड इज नॉट ओनली अबाउट सेइंग कि ये पैसे मैं कहीं और से पूरे कर दूंगा। क्वालिटी ऑफ टैक्सेशन जो है वो फंड आपसे बार बार डिस्कस करता है। सो अगर आपने टैक्सेस भी रखने हैं तो आपको क्वालिटी ऑफ टैक्सेशन रखेगा। मेरी बातों से आपको आज ये जरूर क्लियर होना चाहिए, जो भी सुन रहे हैं, कि क्वालिटी ऑफ योर वर्क डिटरमिन्स हाउ वेल यू डू विद द फंड। क्वालिटी ऑफ योर वर्क डिटरमिन्स कि आपकी क्या फंड के साथ प्रोग्रेस होती है, एंड ऑल्सो पाथ क्या फॉलो होता है। अब मेरा डिस्कंफर्ट कहां आ रहा है? डिस्कंफर्ट ये आ रहा है कि फंड में होते हुए एक सिग्नलिंग सबसे बड़ा इंपैक्ट होना चाहिए। ये हम सब मुल्कों को कहते हैं। इससे क्या मतलब है? इससे मतलब है कि पाकिस्तान की क्रेडिट रेटिंग फिच और मूडीज में नीचे नहीं जानी चाहिए थी, क्योंकि हम नियर डिफॉल्ट पे कैसे चले गए, जबकि फंड एक फुली फंडेड ग्रॉस फाइनेंसिंग चला रहा है, फिस्कल को भी देख रहा है। सो इधर मैं फंड की बहुत बड़ी रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी समझता हूं, जहां मैंने बहुत बात की है रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी ऑफ द अथॉरिटीज की। बिजनेस कॉन्फिडेंस गैलप का देख लें, स्टेट बैंक आईबीए का देख लें, विच इज मे बी मोर साउंड ऑन द इकोनॉमिक फ्रंट। Q1 और Q2 को कंपेयर करें, बहुत ही ज्यादा इस वक्त डाउन है पाकिस्तान में। असम्पशन ऑफ एफएक्स इनफ्लोस, मतलब अभी भी हुकूमत कभी पिलर टू पोस्ट दुनिया में पैसे ढूंढ रही है। जिस दिन ये फाइनेंसिंग ग्रॉस फाइनेंसिंग 31 अरब की हुई थी, ये क्लोज डोर होना चाहिए था, ताकि मार्केट्स की जिटरीनेस खत्म होती, पाकिस्तान के बॉन्ड्स का इंटरेस्ट ठीक होता, सीडीएस वापस 500 के करीब आता, 5,700 पे है, 500 के करीब वापस आता, और आप सेल थ्रू करते। गिवन द पॉलिटिकल फैक्टर्स बिल्कुल वो अपनी जगह हैं। आखिर में 16.3 बिलियन डॉलर्स के रिजर्व्स हाईली अनलाइकली हैं। सो अगेन इसकी फंडिंग ऑफ द प्रोग्राम जो है, अब जब आप नवंबर में करें तो ये सारा काम खुद कर लें, फंड के सामने फिर रखें और फंड में रहें। फंड के बगैर इस वक्त आपके पास कोई चारा नहीं है। अब मैं इस प्रेजेंटेशन की आखिरी 2 स्लाइड्स में मेरी रियलिस्टिक एक्सपेक्टेशन फंड से हमेशा क्या रही है। मेरी ये नहीं रही है कि दे विल डू माय स्ट्रक्चरल वर्क, मेरी ये नहीं रही है कि वो मेरे गवर्नेंस रिफॉर्म्स करेंगे, मेरी ये रही है कि मैं एक डॉलर लिक्विडिटी क्रंच में हूं एज एन अथॉरिटी। उस डॉलर लिक्विडिटी क्रंच से निकालने के लिए फंड की जो सिम्टोमैटिक एंड सम फंडामेंटल चेंजेस हैं वो होने चाहिए। जब मैं ये कहता हूं कि पाकिस्तान ने पार्टली ये काम किया, ये मैं क्यों कहता हूं? जरूर पाकिस्तान ने ये 20-22 प्रोग्राम किए हैं, पर माजरत के साथ 2016 का वाहिद प्रोग्राम है जो एवर पाकिस्तान ने फंड का 12 रिव्यू से कंप्लीट भी किया। अगर आप इस डोज में बिलीव भी करते हैं सिम्टोमैटिक ट्रीटमेंट में और विद सम फंडामेंटल ट्रीटमेंट, यू स्टिल नेवर एवर वेंट बियॉन्ड 2-3 रिव्यूज। मैं 2008-9 में गवर्नमेंट में आया तो मुझे पहला चांस मिला दुबई में फंड के साथ मिलने का, और वो हम प्रोग्राम क्लोज करने गए थे विद इन कोई कुछ रिव्यूज हुए और हमें फंड क्लोज। सो ये याद रखिए, दैट्स व्हाई आई यूज द वर्ड पार्टली। आई सेड आई विल एक्सप्लेन इट टू यू, सो आई एम एक्सप्लेनिंग. Now you avoid a full-blown crisis by doing what I just explained you to do. Do your homework, good quality taxation, MEFP, complete the things that you've agreed with the fund, make a new macro and fiscal framework, put it on the table. Of course, ये सारी चीजें कॉम्पिटेंस और प्रोफेशनल टीम रिक्वायर करती हैं। आई एम होप के पाइड इसमें मदद करेगा। इसके अलावा कुछ ट्विन डेफिसिट्स बेहतर हो जाएंगे। आई कैन पुट सम नंबर्स, बट मैं मैक्रो मॉडलिंग के बगैर वो नंबर्स नहीं रख सकता। ये कंजेक्चरिंग है मेरी कि मैं कहूँ 2% होगा, 3% होगी ग्रोथ। आई वांट टू सी दैट मैक्रो मॉडल, उसमें सारे नंबर वहां से निकलेंगे। QFD में कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा, क्वाज़ी फिस्कल डेफिसिट उसी तरह चलेगा, मेरा नहीं ख्याल। प्राइसिंग चेंजेस से जो फर्क पड़ सकता है वो शायद पड़ जाएगा, बट बहुत कोई रिमार्केबल फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा। Possible uptick in SPP reserves so that we sail till FY23. I would have hoped markets would move more orderly, but मेरी ये prediction गलत हो गई है, markets have not. People will see a slowing growth and a much higher inflation, और largely अहमद ने सही कहा कि ये cost push से आएगी। सो लेट मी एंड कि इससे मेरी अब रियल एक्सपेक्टेशन क्या है। इससे रियल एक्सपेक्टेशन ये है कि पाइड जैसे लोग, हमारे जैसे लोग ये समझ सकें कि पाकिस्तान के बाइंडिंग कंस्ट्रेंट्स ऑन सस्टेनेबल ग्रोथ जो हैं उनको बहुत बड़ा नज चाहिए, मच बियॉन्ड द रेल्म ऑफ एन IMF प्रोग्राम। और ये भी समझ सकें कि कंट्री का जो लॉन्ग टर्म ग्रोथ है वो एक्सक्लूसिवली डोमेस्टिक प्रोडक्टिविटी ग्रोथ से उसका ताल्लुक है, नए पैसे आने से नहीं है। अगर हम ये चीजें समझ सकेंगे, फंड का प्रोग्राम लिक्विडिटी क्रंच रिमूव करेगा, कुछ उसके साथ एडेड चीजों को संभालेंगी और ऑर्डरली करेंगी। और ये चीजें मैं आपके सामने रख रहा हूं कि ये सर्जरी मैंने शुरू कहा था कि हमारे डॉक्टर्स ने करनी है, जिस दिन भी डिसाइड करेंगे करने का आप जरूर करें। और वो नंबर 1 ये है कि पॉकेट्स ऑफ कॉम्पिटेंस बिल्ड करें। मेरा नहीं ख्याल कि पाकिस्तान में, अहमद ने रखा ये सामने के रिफॉर्म एग्जीक्यूटिव का होना चाहिए, मैं होते हुए नहीं देख रहा, मे बी आई होप आई एम रॉन्ग। पॉकेट्स ऑफ कॉम्पिटेंस, चाहे वो प्लानिंग हो, प्राइवेटाइजेशन हो, एनर्जी हो, फाइनेंस हो, इन 4 में क्रिएट करिए और ये काम करने की कोशिश कीजिए। एनर्जी सेक्टर में बोर्ड्स बनाना, अहमद मेरे हाथ से, क्योंकि ये मेरा ख्याल है कोई 10, 20, 25 बोर्ड्स बने होंगे, ये इनइफेक्टिव चीज है। मच दुनिया में जब तक हम अब डिसरप्टिव मोड में नहीं जाएंगे एनर्जी सेक्टर पे, हम इसको हल नहीं कर पाएंगे। That would be my thinking. Agriculture is a first natural for me on this. और कई दफा डॉक्टर साहब से इस पर डिस्कशन हुई, why is it? Because it's a tradable sector. अभी भी क्या 8-10 अरब डॉलर की इंपोर्ट करना पड़ रही है। यील्ड्स को आप देखिए, मैं हमेशा कॉटन की मिसाल देता हूँ, 1.7 मिलियन पर हेक्टर आपकी है, 9-10 चाइना ऑस्ट्रेलिया की है। सो जब तक आप प्रोडक्टिविटी का मसला एग्रीकल्चर का हल नहीं करते, इस इकोनॉमी में आप स्टेबिलिटी और फूड सिक्योरिटी नहीं ला सकते। क्यों मेरा ऑर्डर यही है जो मैंने आपके सामने रखा है। Of course, creating an outward-looking industrial sector. Of course, एक inward हो गया. I was reading a good report, and the rest. So I hope someday, inshallah, we will move on these things.
Thank you, Hakan. Thank you very much. Good overview. But I think, quite frankly, to use your medical analogy, this is like going to an emergency ward. Fund is the emergency ward of the world, and what you're saying is basically the fund is giving us repeatedly steroids to keep us alive, and leaving the rest of the stuff to us, which is fine. But at the same time, like a good doctor, the fund should also be telling us that there are fundamental weaknesses in the economy. For example, the fund points out in many places that technical assistance is required. And then they say technical assistance will come from ADB or from the World Bank or from wherever, DFID or whatever they name, but 3 or 4 agencies from where the technical assistance will come. But nowhere do they mention that, hey, there's local people available too. So local people are knocked out, as you say. So the issue really is we have to get deeper. We can obviously, we all know ultimately looking after your body is your job, not the medical emergency doctor's job. And we all know that if we don't work hard, but if the emergency doctor keeps putting us on steroids and keep giving us a drug where we are kind of drug to sleep. And I think, quite frankly, even though, as you know, I've worked with the IMF for 30 years, I've done many programs, etc., I have the knowledge, but I don't think that the IMF should be totally held not responsible for our problems. And when you said that we finished the program in 2016, we completed 12 reviews, but each of them had huge latitudes. Each of the reviews we were given a huge amount of latitude, and the quasi-fiscal deficit has grown. We have not fixed it. The pricing problem has grown. Exchange rate, every fund program, I've documented every fund program, the exchange rate appreciates, doesn't depreciate. And we talk about market-based exchange rate, but it doesn't happen. Khurram Saab, over to you.
Okay, well, many thanks. I'll keep my remarks brief and mostly just focused on the paper. I've spent yesterday reading through the paper. Just had a little bit of feedback for the authors, and then I think we can move to the discussion phase of this. So, 2 things I appreciated about the paper: the emphasis on structural reform, and I think it's correct to say, and I think many people had pointed this out back in July 2019 as well, that the program that was signed at that time was actually very weak on the structural reform side. And I remember when the IMF did its round of meetings with various people, I was among the people that they met when they came here in Karachi. And this is something we were pointing out to them as well. They tried to not argue back, but they tried to sort of present some of the reform measures in it, saying कि नहीं देखें इसमें ये भी है, इसमें वो भी है, to try and say कि नहीं, there is a structural reform emphasis, but it wasn't really very convincing. I mean, streamlining the ability to set up a company, for example, reducing the number of steps required to register a company doesn't count as a path-breaking structural reform of some sort, except for the state bank autonomy bill. But that hasn't really turned out to be that big of a deal. I mean, we've got an autonomous state bank on paper, but we don't really have an autonomous state bank in reality. I mean, it's not behaving like an autonomous central bank. And quite possibly in this country, you can't have one. But in any case, I think the author's emphasis on structural reforms is good. We can discuss and debate whether the kind of structural reforms they advance are the right ones, or it should be something different. But nevertheless, I think that mantra should be kept up, and we should keep reminding all of our respective audiences that until Pakistan gets its structural house in order, in terms of deep-rooted structural reforms, we're never going to be out of this cycle of finding ourselves bankrupt every few years and asking for assistance. The other thing I appreciated from the part of the authors was a renewed focus on redistribution and redistributive politics. I think that economics, sorry. I think that is particularly required now more than ever before in the past, because we are coming out of a phase of a very malign form of growth that happened in this country, that aggravated the deficits, it aggravated the imbalances in the economy, it aggravated inequalities, because this growth specifically was premised on putting more and more public resources into the hands of the rich, in the hopes that they will invest and that investment will create jobs and those jobs will create incomes. But nevertheless, I think at a time like this, redistribution is something that should be near the top of the policymakers' agenda. Question is how to do it. And I agree with Hakan Saab that the social protection measures in place right now are inadequate for the task, assuming I understood you correctly, Hakan Saab. I'm not saying that they should not be pursued, but I'm saying by all means, do everything you can through the existing social protection mechanisms, but it will not be enough. I think we need more ideas on this side, more work to perhaps even rope in the provincial governments to figure out. Surprisingly, COVID was a good time in which to actually have developed robust mechanisms for social protection, but also support for unemployed and maybe a move towards universal basic income if something like that is possible in a country like Pakistan. There was an ideal opportunity at that point in time to really ramp up our thinking on this direction, but instead we used that opportunity to come up with amnesty schemes instead, and sort of blew it. Amnesty schemes, negative real interest rates, and the oldest of the old ideas on how to boost growth using means that aggravate the deficits and its imbalances. So I think the emphasis on redistribution is something that I would encourage the authors to please take up as the subject matter of a separate paper and think it through very deeply and come back to us with further ideas on how this can be developed further. Two areas in which I would ask the authors to possibly rethink some of the lines and positions that they have taken. Nadeem, I will disagree partially with you and with Hakan Saab regarding the roots of inflation in the country today, and with what the authors of the paper are saying. I think we need to take the monetary roots of the current bout of inflation very, very seriously. There is plenty of evidence that money supply growth was out of control in the 18 months running between June 2020 and December 2021. This is not something to just sort of proclaim and say, "Bhai, ye ho raha tha ya nahi ho raha tha." We've all seen the headlines about supply chain disruptions and whatnot. The task before us is slightly more complex. to disaggregate the drivers behind the current bout of inflation. To do that, I would encourage you to take another look at the monetary aggregates in those 18 months. Look at them against the trend lines of the past 15 years. Real money supply growth. If you divide it by inflation, okay, just take broad money divided by the CPI index and plot that for the past 15 years. And tell me if the trend lines post June 2020 are going higher than where they should be based on where they were for the past decade. If so, then that money supply, that incremental distance between where you are and where the trend line says you should be, is inflationary. It means, and it signals that there will be inflation a year or 18 months down the road. So are we seeing that happen or not? Number two, please help me understand why, if this is purely supply side inflation, why is it so broad based, and why is the broad basing of it so evident from the period roughly around like April, May of 2021 onwards. Number three, please also help me understand, if it's supply side driven, why are inflationary outcomes in Pakistan so much more aggravated compared to our regional peers in India and Bangladesh? They have been hit by the same supply side pressures that we have been. Why are they have inflation too, but why is our inflation so much more aggravated by comparison to theirs? Help me also understand why the inflation today is more aggravated compared to the inflation outcomes of 2010 or 11, which were also taking place in the midst of a supply side shock. In fact, oil prices were higher back then than they are today, and higher for a prolonged and protracted period. Just answer a simple question for me. Why is it that when we had $100 plus oil back in 2011, and in fact for 4 years running we had $100 plus oil, or somewhere around that that time period, prices at the pump were not what they are today, right? I know the answer. I know what you will say. You will say the exchange rate is what is different between then and now. And then I ask you to tell me, is that not a monetary factor, right? Is money supply expansion, when you go on a rupee printing spree of the sort that they went on from June 2020 till December 2021, is that not going to hit the exchange rate? Will you not have more rupees chasing fewer dollars? And will that exchange rate devaluation, which itself is a monetary phenomenon, a reflection of monetary factors, will that not appear on the surface as a supply side shock, whereas in reality it's actually money supply driven? I would urge you to take the monetary roots more seriously. In your own paper, you note that broad money growth is expected to rise by 12% in the forthcoming year. You say that is a very low amount. You know, given the GDP growth rate, given that GDP is about to grow less than 3%, actually a 12% increase in broad money supply is actually quite a lot. It's not very little. There is a school of thought which says that money supply increase should not outpace the increase in the supply of goods and services in the economy. Which means if your economy, or particularly your commodity producing sector, is growing at 3 or 4%, your money supply growth should not be higher than that for any protracted period of time. So I would urge you to maybe consider that more seriously and think through the ramifications that this has for interest rates. I don't want to argue that we should have 25% interest rates, or even 20%, or even 15%. I find it very crude, what the textbook says about the connection between interest rates and expected inflation. I think there are more complex factors at play. But nevertheless, where do we stand in terms of our monetary aggregates currently? And how do we rectify that those underlying imbalances, if there are any, would be another interesting thing I would like to see come out of from the present authors. Similarly, I would urge you to take import growth a little bit, give it a second look. You mentioned in the paper, for example, that Pakistan's import growth has been, per capita, has been lower over the past decade compared to developing countries. Fair enough. But I will simply say that looking at import growth on per capita basis is not convincing. Okay, it's not how many people you have that determines whether your imports are sustainable or not. It's your ability to pay for those imports. So put that import growth in the context of Pakistan's ability to earn foreign exchange reserves, first of all. I would like to see the use of more sophisticated, shall we say, ratios in order to assess Pakistan's external sector sustainability and how it has evolved over the past decade. I would like to know, for example, that our external debt repayments for the past 15 years as a proportion of our net current receipts. So you take external debt repayments over the past 15 years for every single year, and for that particular year, just divided by exports plus remittances and multiply by 100 and plot that percentage and tell me where that line is going. That will be a much more meaningful line to tell me about what is happening with Pakistan's external debt, external sustainability. And it is clearly on a declining path, unmistakably so. I think all of us, I'm not an economist, contrary to, sorry, Nadeem, but you introduced me as one. I write on the economy, but that doesn't make me an economist. I'm actually a journalist who just happens to cover the economy. But all of us, whether economists, whether policymakers, or whether journalists, have, I think, a bit of a responsibility to guide the public conversation in a direction to increase awareness about Pakistan's growing structural vulnerabilities, because these vulnerabilities are taking us to a very bad place collectively. I think we all know that. But sadly, I think there are not many people beyond our limited community that yet realize this fully. And I think papers of the sort that have just been written and put out by PIDE play a very valuable role in promoting that. But I would also then encourage that the authors do not shy away from the political controversies that your statements may well land you in. Do not be afraid of that. The economy, I've rarely seen the economy more politicized than it is today. There are powerful narratives that are right now competing for the common man's or even the layperson, the educated layperson's attention. One narrative is saying everything was going well until the vote of no confidence, and then suddenly everything fell apart. Another narrative says, no, the pressures were a long time in building up and happened independently, and the unraveling of those growth rates happened independently of the vote of no confidence. Whatever findings you put out that either support or challenge either of these narratives are going to become or begin to play out on a political space. Don't be afraid of that. This is part of the responsibility that we all have to play in order to do our part in advancing the cause of economic awareness, so that the right environment can be made to make the right kind of decisions of the sort that maybe Hakan Saab was pointing out, and of the sort that Nadeem has been urging for, I think, more years than he cares to count. I'll stop at that, and I'd be very keen to hear from the audience from here on. Thank you.
Thank you, Khurram Saab. Thank you very much. I think it's wonderful. Good comments. I agree with you on the monetary policy issue. No disagreement. Yes, of course, monetary policy is very important, and monetary policy does cause inflation. As Friedman said, inflation is everywhere a monetary phenomenon. There's no question about that. And certainly money growth helped increase this. But I think the mistake that we often make on inflation is we don't distinguish between the trend inflation and the short run inflation, and we have to figure out what the trend is, what the short run is. And yes, of course, we need a lot more work on that, and absolutely we should do that. And the second point on imports, again, I think you made a good point. Imports and our ability to debt service are a very important question, and we should talk about them. But I think, quite frankly, our ability to, all these issues, underlying all these issues that the fund doesn't talk about, nobody talks about really, is whenever we do economic analysis, whether it's monetary policy or whether it's the IMF program, when Hakan was talking about the model, the financial programming model, for example, the fundamental assumption, I used to teach that for many years, the fundamental assumption in a financial program is really what the growth rate is going to be over the coming period or whatever. And we tend to subsume it then. The growth rate is assumed and then we tend to subsume it, because remember, all our macro variables are deflated by the GDP. And we can only discuss those in terms of ratios of GDP, otherwise it doesn't make any sense. Those real variables don't, nominal variables don't mean much. And even when you deflate them by inflation, they don't mean much unless you scale them by GDP. So that's a very important component to think about. And unfortunately, we don't discuss growth at all in Pakistan. Our ability to finance debt, or ability to finance the fiscal position, or our ability to absorb a certain amount of monetary growth. You talked about the 12% nominal growth. Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, nominal GDP is really just, growth rate plus the rate of inflation. And so your nominal GDP is really trying to figure out how much of an inflation rate you will accommodate. So if it's a 12% growth rate and 3% 12% nominal GDP growth and 3% real GDP growth, you're accommodating a 9% inflation growth. And we all know that some inflation should be accommodated. Now the question is, what is the target rate? We have to think about that and talk about that. So these are all issues that I wish we could discuss. Unfortunately, there's not much demand for these issues in Pakistan. That's why we thought we'd do this, and we'd like to do this more often, because at least our students will get some education, and that's important. So I thank you for your comments. Let's try and go to take some questions now. Mahmood Khalid.
Sir, thank you very much. Really thought-provoking discussions from all the three panelists. My simple question from the panelists, or specifically to Dr. Hakan Najib, is that how does he consider the budget strategy paper to be the only single macroeconomic framework which we often see in terms of how the fiscal policy making? And the second question about the taxation side is specifically that we normally set it once we have the expenditure layouts for us. And on top of that, when the IMF comes in, then they have to put some extra pressures in terms of delivering to their needs. And often we see the mini budgets also coming into the picture. So do you think that such kinds of policy which are under the influence of IMF is not only distorting the way a good policy making is being done, and it is further creating problems? The second question which I would like to ask him is about the way we are trying to manage our balance of payment accounts. Our deficits are being created from the current account side, and it is financed on a perpetual basis from the capital account side. So do you think that it is going to work in a long-term sense where one deficit is potentially financed by another side's borrowing, which is debt, which is not going to be repaid by itself? So how does that fit in terms of long-term management of the balance of payment side? Thank you.
So देखें, बहुत अच्छा आपने पूछा. BSP एक ऐसा डॉक्यूमेंट है जो हम लेके जाते थे टू दी कैबिनेट. So एक उससे एक खदोखाल सामने आ जाता था कि how are we thinking about the budget? And it was actually a document which should have been then open to the academia, which should have been open to the local doctors, which should have been open to PIDE and all the others, to give input into it. ये हम फाइनेंस में ही बनाते थे, एंड कैबिनेट से एक सरसरी सी उसकी डिस्कशन होती थी, और यू नो कि सबसे ज्यादा बात होती थी डॉक्टर साहब की जो लास्ट अपॉइंटमेंट थी एज डेप्यूटी चेयरमैन के पीएनडी में कितने प्रोजेक्ट हैं और उन प्रोजेक्ट्स में से क्या हो रहा है. And that was of interest, of course, to the politicians.
ये बड़ी अच्छी बात की आपने कि सरसरी डिस्कशन होती है और सारा फोकस प्रोजेक्ट्स पे होता है. Sorry, I had to interrupt that.
नो. अच्छा, ये होती थी. अच्छा, अब बात यह है कि चलें, अगर ये भी हो जाती थी तो काम तो सारा जो है वो हमारा ये होना चाहिए. यहाँ पे मैं कहता हूँ कि एक थॉट प्रोसेस का चेंज कर लें. वो ये है कि अगर हमने बना भी दिया फाइनेंस में, तो लेट्स ओपन इट टू एकेडेमिया, लेट्स ओपन इट टू इंस्टीट्यूशंस लाइक पाइड, और थोड़ी सी लोकल इनपुट ले. ये आपको एक क्रेडेंस भी देगी, एक क्रेडिबिलिटी भी देगी, और आपको फंड से बात करने की एक पावर देगी. मैं आपको एक मिसाल देता हूँ कि हाउ डिड, डॉक्टर साहब ने कहा, मैं डॉक्टर साहब को वो नहीं करना कहना चाह रहा, बट कि 12 रिव्यूज में बहुत सी चीजें मनवाई गई। आई होप कि एक वीडियो बन रही होती पार्क हायट दुबई के उस कमरे की जहां पे ये निगोशिएशन हो रही थी। I should be humble about it, and I am being humble. But the authorities from Pakistan at that time and the team that we had put together was good, and a lot of things came our way because we were very well prepared. So all in all, again, it's अच्छा, अब बजट स्ट्रैटेजी पेपर ही अगर आप डॉक्यूमेंट ले लें तो उसको बहुत बेहतर किया जा सकता है। अब आप देखें कि हमने अभी जनवरी में बजट दिया है, उसकी आज सैंक्टिटी तकरीबन खत्म हो चुकी है, टैक्सेशन पे भी खत्म हो चुकी है, उसकी सैंक्टिटी ग्रोथ पे भी खत्म हो चुकी है। फ्लड्स का जरूर इम्पैक्ट है, बट हम शुरू ही इतनी बड़ी एडजस्टमेंट से हुए थे। सो ऑफ कोर्स आई थिंक ये बजट स्ट्रैटेजी पेपर अगर एक डॉक्यूमेंट है आपका, हम वैसे एक 3 साल का मैक्रो फ्रेमवर्क भी बनाते हैं, बट the quality of that framework, the discussion that is required is really, I mean, of a different caliber. On your current account question, देखिए मेरा ये ख्याल है कि current account पर से रन करना is not a bad thing. करंट अकाउंट को फाइनेंस करने की एबिलिटी रखना जो है वो सबसे बड़ी बात है। पाकिस्तान, हम सेविंग्स तो लेंगे दुनिया की, सेविंग्स लिए बगैर तो मसला नहीं चलेगा, आपने मतलब इन्वेस्ट करना है पाकिस्तान में। अब ये आपने सही बात की है, उसको फाइनेंस करना सबसे बड़ी बात है। एक मैं इसमें सजेशन जो है गवर्नमेंट को अब दे रहा हूं वो ये दे रहा हूं कि यार अपनी कंपनीज को कहें कि वो बाहर जाकर खुद अपनी मशीनरी को फाइनेंस करें। सो लेट मी रिपीट दैट फॉर यू. What am I trying to say here? The financing of the current account will come down substantively. अगर आप अपनी कंपनीज को भी देखें ना, सारा बोझ जो है डिस्कशन का वो चला जाता है कि सरकार की कॉम्पिटेंस क्या है और उसने क्या करना है। हमें ये भी देखना है ना कि आपके पास कौन सी ऐसी कंपनीज हैं जो इंटरनेशनली अपने बलबूते पर, चाहे वो द गुड वंस हो, वो लॉन्च करें और कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर डिफरेंटली फाइनेंस करने की कैपेसिटी रखें। These are the ideas that you really need to start debating. ये चीजें इतनी मुश्किल हैं नहीं है जितनी अब दिखाई देना शुरू हो गई हैं। डॉक्टर साहब, मैं आपके एक पॉइंट पे कमेंट करना चाह रहा हूं। आपने बहुत अच्छी बात की और यही मैं बार बार कहता हूं कि अगर आप फंड को ये कहेंगे ना कि वो आपको ये बताए कि कौन से बिजली घर चलाने हैं या कौन से बिजली घर लगाने हैं या डिस्को कैसे बेचना है, ये उनका काम नहीं है। वो बार बार, मतलब 12 रिव्यूज वो और 4 रिव्यूज मैंने इस प्रोग्राम के करवाए हैं, वो बार बार एडीबी और वर्ल्ड बैंक के पास जाते थे कि आप बताएं क्या करना है। मैं ये कहता था और अब भी कहता हूं कि उन्होंने भी करके देख लिया है। अब वक्त वो आ गया है कि फंड पे प्लीज ना रिलाई करें इस चीज की, चाहे वो प्लानिंग कमीशन हो, चाहे वो पाइड हो, जो भी हो, वो खुद इस चीज को आगे लेकर चले। क्या फंड आपको रोक रहा है कि एलएनजी पावर प्लांट्स ना बेच दें? क्या फंड आपको रोक रहा है कि आप डिस्कोज में जाके सर्जरी ना कर दें? कहां रोक रहा है? आज तक फंड ने सीपैक नहीं रोका। 2013-16 में फुली हम चला रहे थे उसको, तो बाकी कैसे चीज रोक सकती है? ओनस हमारे पे है। दुनिया में ग्रोथ उन ममालिक ने की है जिन्होंने ये ओनस अपने पे लिया है। नहीं लेंगे तो मुश्किल में रहेंगे।
I would be keen to know what question the iPhone wants to ask.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to iPhone. iPhone, go ahead.
Yeah.
Identify yourself and ask the question.
Hey, my name is Daniel Aziz. I'm
Good job. Please, Daniel, go ahead.
ex-member of the National Parliament. I'd like to thank Khurram for identifying the iPhone so that I get a chance to speak. I have one comment and then one question. One of the most important things I think that people of Pakistan are facing today is the current inflation. However, if we look at the provisioning in the IMF document, which was from August 2022, even though in previous reviews they have spoken very loudly about having at least a slightly positive real interest rate, primarily to control inflation. And in the February review that they did, they had pegged the projections of inflation at 10.4. However, in August, they projected it at 21% headline inflation. So with our current interbank offered rate at 15%, or the signal rate by the state bank at 15%, clearly there's room, if you want a positive real interest rate, to increase that to be able to reduce inflation. However, the provisioning for that, given that Pakistan government has taken on 60% of the debt of the entire banking system, the interest rate payments that the government of Pakistan would have to face had those rates gone up would cause the fiscal deficit to swell, for which the IMF is very strict that that's to be, at least in this program, somewhat of a primary surplus. So it's a very strange thing to me that knowing that the projected 21% inflation rate is there, and that the interest rate, in order to be even mildly positive, would have to be raised a lot, having a reflection on the budget deficit, that provisioning never took place. And in fact, if you look at the August 2022 review, you will find that suddenly the positive real interest rate demand, which is very loud in previous reviews, somewhat gets muted all of a sudden. So for those of us who do believe that inflation is a monetary phenomenon, then the interest rate clearly is one of the variables that needs to be modulated in order to deal with that. And that, I think, is something that this document from PIDE has completely missed. That provisioning, that was the responsibility of the IMF, in case they did believe, and they have in previous reviews believed, that a positive real interest rate is crucial to control inflation, and not provision for it in your program. I think that was something that was quite irresponsible and has a huge to the detriment of the people of Pakistan. So, ek baat to ye hai. Dusra, the other thing I'd like to say is that clearly the problem that Pakistan is currently facing began somewhere in the early part of this millennium. And in that, with the advent of the Afghan war, we saw a huge flood of dollars come to Pakistan. And that is where, for those 10 years between 2002 and about 2009-10, that Pakistan shifted from being primarily an export-oriented economy to an import-oriented economy. And if you look at the documentation or the evidence for that, clearly you can see that the trade imbalance went from about 0.5 billion at that time in 2002-03 to 31 billion now currently. So that huge explosion in the trade imbalance, the difference between imports and exports, is what we've been trying to finance through debt. But we created an economy that basically relied on imports because we had Afghan war dollars. That transition now is something that's pending, because the new exchange rates that we have to follow for the market, and the new interest rate, if at all we want to control inflation, would be probably somewhere around 21-22%. The current industrial base that we've developed based on that 10-year massive investment, if you look at the gross fixed capital formation, it's huge. It's in hundreds of billions. So we invested in plant and machinery at that time because we had the fiscal, the banking space, the credit space. And now that industrial base is basically not viable at the current market exchange rates, at current interest rates, if we have a positive real interest rate. So whether it's leasing cars or this whole consumer finance bonanza that came up at that time under Shaukat Aziz and others, and the end literally of project-based finance after the privatization of the banking structure, all of that has led us to this point where we cannot finance the imports with debt anymore because we can't get any more debt. And if we want our economy to grow, what we have to do is import. So that is the catch-22, and that requires a transition plan. So I thought that this document didn't really address that issue, that how Pakistan is going to transition from what what is basically a khud kafalat, or a type of an economic program with industrialization, to one that's based on comparative advantage. And clearly, if you go towards comparative advantage production, then agriculture is the pink elephant in the room. So I think those are the two of the things I'd like to say, that I didn't think that the paper addressed that.
Good points, Daniel. I agree with you on the first one, that of course, absolutely correct, that the fund had not. And this happens in many fund programs. And I remember when we used to do fund programs, we had to contend with this, and we had to kind of hand wave our way through it. So yes, of course, I appreciate that. Very correct. Oh shit, have I unmuted myself? Yes, I have. Okay, let's take your second point. I think there I don't agree, because I think we pointed to a number of structural issues. The problem in Pakistan is everybody agrees is that we really don't want to do the structural reform that is necessary. And to put it quite simply, as Daniel, you have told me very often, and I agree with you, that the colonial system has to go. All this is being done to preserve the colonial system of, the judges, the bureaucrats, and the controls that we have. Hakan talked about the Ministry of Finance, but I think I know very well, and Hakan also probably will agree, there are hardly any skills in the Ministry of Finance. They rely on a few consultants to do the job, and at some point we keep talking about negotiating the MEFP and making the MEFP, but I don't think the Ministry of Finance has the skills. Hakan, I'll bring you in later to talk about that. Ji Fasi Mangi Sahab. Fasi Mangi. Bloomberg se Fasi Mangi Sahab. Fasi Sahab, can you unmute yourself? बोलिए बोलिए फसी साहब, अब आ गई बात आ रही है. ओह, फसी साहब बोलिए. फसी साहब, I can't hear you. No, sorry, Fasi Saab, please.
Hear me now? Sorry.
Now we can hear you. Boलिए, बोलिए.
I'm just wanted to make a few points that Khurram and Hakan made. One was that Hakan said that in the IMF program, we're in an IMF program and the markets are still not reacting the way they are. Khurram made a very good observation that external sustainability, how it's declined over the years. So my question to all three of you is basically, the gross financing is 31 billion. We're having difficulty meeting it this year. Is this problem going to just keep growing? And maybe we're not seeing a default in the next 6 months, but are we seeing a default in the next 5 or 10 years?
I take that first, please.
Go ahead.
Nadeem?
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, Fasi. Yes, I think 5 to 10 years, it's almost a given. Just look at the trend, okay? I mean, anytime you want to look 10 years or 5 years into the future, just look about 20 years into the past and see what the line that is coming out of the past is showing you. And what the line is showing us is that since the year 2000, Pakistan has availed itself of at least 3 different bailouts. We've been bailed out 3 times. With each bailout, the size of the crisis that we were facing grew larger. By the standards of external sustainability. I think domestically, then there were other aspects to the crisis and whatnot. Each bailout was larger than the one that came before it. And with each bailout, we saw a larger number of creditors participating in it. The number of creditors has grown with every bailout. The amounts required to bail the country out have increased. The number of creditors required has increased further still. So the game is becoming more and more and more complicated. And if we assume that this is going to continue, absent any structural changes, this game is going to actually continue, then yes, 5 to 10 years, the next bailout that Pakistan asks for, and right now it's a bit of it's like since 2018, it's been an endless series of bailouts that Pakistan has been asking. I'm hard pressed to decide whether the present calls for a bailout are part of an extended sort of a bailout program for Pakistan that began in 2018 and has just not ended since then, or is this like a fresh round of bailouts? It's hard to sort of differentiate. But 5 to 10 years from now, this game, if something fundamental doesn't change, is going to become incredibly complicated. Already it's become complicated. You ask one sector, they asked the Paris Club for debt rescheduling or debt relief, and they pointed to the Chinese and said, go ask them first. And they went to China. I don't know if they discussed debt relief, but they came back saying, well, kuch khas mila to nahi, but yes, we've got 4 new corridors on CPEC. They went to Saudi Arabia asking for cash. They came back with a promise to build a refinery of some sort. This isn't doing it for them at all. The game is getting more and more complicated. It means it's going to become even more complicated 5 to 10 years from now, especially when the proportion of Chinese debt and American debt or Paris Club debt are very, very high. We don't know what the relations between these countries are going to be like. We're asking both of them for bailouts. So Yeah, I think over the next 5 to 10 years, some kind of a decisive moment could well be reached if the present trajectory is not altered in significant, if the present course is not altered significantly.
Absolutely right. I agree with you entirely. Absolutely correct. I don't think we'll get out of fund program till 2028, 2030. I think we'll remain in a fund program, and thereafter the situation looks very bad unless we begin to do the reform that is necessary. Let me ask both of you, do you think the government even has the technical capacity to make the reform? Hakan, you was speaking a lot about the finance ministry. Does the finance ministry have the technical capability? Does the energy ministry have the technical capability to make the reform? Or is the IMF right that ADB and the World Bank will come and do it? And can the ADB, then you turn around and say ADB and the World Bank can't do it, they can only write reports. So, hey, something doesn't add up. Who is going to do the work that is necessary? You talk about macro modeling, you talk about MEFP. Who's actually going to do that work?
So, Dr. Saab, that's the, jisko kahiye na Urdu mein kehte hain kalidi questions. That's the fundamental question, right? I mean, you can give it to the ADB, or you can give it to the multilaterals, or you can, send it somewhere to be done, or you can do the macro modeling that the fund does in the EA wing or in the planning commission. That onus is again on you, right?
No. Hakan, my question is not the onus. Do we even have the capacity to do it, Hakan? I mean, onus, yes. I've been in the planning commission. I've been in the Ministry of Finance. You've seen that. I mean, I don't think there's even one person. Baloch is the only guy who can make the budget. The rest don't even know what the budget is. In the Ministry of Planning, it's Asif Sheikh who knows the planning, who knows the PSTP. Nobody else knows. We copy the same economic survey. We copy the same annual development thing every year. But there's nothing new there. So, I mean, for God's sakes, who's doing the research in the government?
So absolutely right. So when I said you have to start your structural reform, the first thing I put as my thing is you have to build core areas of competence in these ministries without forgetting.
How can you do that in this structure? In this structure where the finance secretary runs everything, you've seen that even the minister of finance is beholden to the finance secretary, and the finance secretary wants to control everything. Who's going to build the capacity unless the finance secretary turns over and becomes a good sort of, guy himself?
So one, that happens, and then so we are going into a different area. The other, of course, my thing is that the politicians, whichever party is in power, has to plan before, has to get their boys and girls on board, have people like us on their thing, and then run the government once they come. So that I have been with 3 new governments and 2-3 caretaker setups closely, and when they arrive, they see the quantum of challenge that is in front of them. That quantum of challenge should have been seen a couple of months before coming into power, and then they make that competence. Ya secretaries karenge, ya political leadership karegi. In dono mein se kisi ne karna hai. Constituency of reform aap, main aur Khurram aur baki jo log aaj maujood hain wo banane ki koshish karenge. I think ye hai constellation which has to come together.
Okay, good. Shahid Saab, last question. Shahid.
Ji, thank you. Am I audible, sir?
You are.
Thank you, Ji. Thank you, Hakan Saab and Khurram, for this very nice talk. I'm Shahid Mahmood, Research Fellow at PIDE. एक दो चीजें मैं आपसे सिर्फ आप लोगों ने काफी इस पे बात होगी है. खाकान साहब ने बात की थी BISP के उस पे कि जी we've got data of 900 million people. 90 million. So उस पे millions of people, but I'd like to disagree with that. If you look at it from a simple cost benefit analysis, you're spending up more than ₹1 trillion just to get data. Would that sound logical? I don't think so. ठीक है जी. तो ये और दूसरा ये है कि having worked there, it's अब खैर वो बात कहीं और चली जाएगी. दूसरी बात आपने की कि पॉलिटिशियंस पे और ये सेक्रेटरीज पे डिपेंड करता है, बट द एलिफेंट इन द रूम उसका भी आप नाम ले. अभी शौकत तरीन साहब जो है हमारे फॉर्मर फाइनेंस मिनिस्टर, उन्होंने खुद बताया था कि जी हमें जर्नैलों ने बुलाया था, मैं था, मिफ्ता था और हमारे साथ एक और था, वो जर्नैल साहब हमसे इंटरव्यू ले रहे थे कि आप लोग आगे क्या प्रोग्राम है. तो मतलब क्या इकोनॉमी उन्होंने चलानी है, क्या करना है उन्होंने? तो you didn't name them. So just मैंने उन पे एक addition कर दी.
That's really not something. Zargham Khan Saab, then I'll come back to the panel. Last question, Zargham. Energies are. Go ahead.
Not energies are, sir. A couple of things. One, I mean, the first presentation, the first जो document share किया गया था, उसमें there are a couple of things that are missing in it. I mean, when we talk of energy sector, it is probably considered that energy sector is only power sector. What about gas? What about petroleum? What about oil and gas? They are equally responsible for the situation that we are in right now, or the situation which is getting worse. So they have to be there. Second, sir, जो आप हमेशा, I mean, I've a long association with you and Dr. Saab as well. Reform की हमेशा बात होती है. I mean, we say that there has to be a reform, and we say that आपकी presentation के अंदर भी था, these are the reforms that need to be done. But these reforms in particular setup of, I'm strictly talking about power sector, energy sector, because I've been there, so I can only talk about that. I don't know anything about economics and anything else. But when we talk of reforms, and these reforms having identified these are reforms to be done in Pakistan, in our sector, but have anybody done due diligence in terms of identifying those reforms that are suitable for Pakistan's typical energy sector? We talk about World Bank, Asian Development Bank की बात हुई, and we say that Asian Development Bank and World Bank वो तो control C and control V के ऊपर हैं. I mean, they do a cut and they do a paste. So what are those reforms before we go, and who's to implement that, and who has a responsibility to get these things done? At least I'm not aware that these reforms in the energy sector or in the power sector have been customized for Pakistan. I mean, who's going to do that? These are to be identified first. I mean, world की जो success examples हैं, they might not work for Pakistan. There might be a requirement for Pakistan to have a unique solution for it. So who would be doing that, sir? So in my opinion, reforms को journal address करके ये कहना है कि these are to be done, उससे पहले करने की ये जरूरत है कि ये होनी चाहिए पाकिस्तान के लिए. World best examples modified, because अभी तक all world best examples are being said कि जी ये पाकिस्तान के अंदर यही वाली implement होनी चाहिए. So I think that needs to be done in this thing, sir, as well. So this was my comment on it, sir.
I think very good point. We have to think about homegrown domestic reforms. I think all three of you are saying roughly the same thing, and we have to develop a debate on that. And that is why we at PIDE are trying to do this. We are taking a conference to Quetta as well. I urge you to come join us. The Pakistan Society of Development Economics is also doing a conference in Quetta on the Charter of Economy, because we think it's an important issue to talk about and address. Quite frankly, my effort here at PIDE has been to wake up the university sector. The university sector is totally ignored. We've got 260 universities that are contributing nothing to public policy debate. And sadly, we treat them as merely a teaching institution, and teachers themselves think of themselves as teachers. So we've got 260 tuition centers which really don't contribute to the reform sector. To answer your question, yes, the university sector should be involved, should be doing reform issues. But there's a problem also. The World Bank and ADB and IMF also doesn't like to involve the university sector. They only think that they can talk to a few businessmen and the Ministry of Finance, sit in Dubai and Qatar and, make a program. So there are huge structural issues. We have to deal with them. So last words to you, Khurram, please.
Okay, I think much has been said, and we all have a lot to think about from this event. I'll just leave us with this thought that I think the IMF cannot want reform in Pakistan more badly than the Pakistani authorities themselves do. So, you mentioned homegrown and whatnot. I mean, wholeheartedly, increasingly over the years, I've come to the conclusion that it's from among us that a will to reform has to first emerge, first and foremost. And then the capacities need to be found. And then the roadmap needs to be drawn. And but producing that will, I think Shahid's intervention was quite critical. We need to get the political house in order. and which means let the politicians run the country and let the generals run the battlefields, and let everyone play their constitutional role. But so long as the system itself is discordant and at conflict with itself, I think it's futile to expect high quality decisions coming out of it as a result. So that's where I'd like to leave it. Develop the will first, then the capacity, and then the roadmap. But getting to the will means getting the political decision making where anchoring it where it belongs, and then move forward.
In other words, you're giving us a very grim prognosis that somewhere along the line we have to hit rock bottom and develop a crisis that we cannot waste.
I sincerely hope we never hit rock bottom, because that's actually a state of affairs that I think a lot of people underestimate about how bad it can get. And yeah, I think somewhere the will has to emerge before we hit rock bottom. Realization on the part of various players who are responsible for producing that will. That's not you and me, Nadeem. That's that's not even the civil servants. That's the decision making at the highest levels in the state. And the will over there will only emerge once the overextended positions that each party over there has taken, is sort of unwound, and people realize that there's a collective interest at stake, which is larger than the individual interests or the vested interests they're all seeking to protect. Beyond that, it's just academic talk that we're having.
Yeah. The problem is that unfortunately, many countries have gone through these episodes. Brazil, Argentina come to mind, Mexico comes to mind. The worst is Yugoslavia comes to mind, the Soviet Union comes to mind, Russia comes to mind. Many countries have gone through these catastrophes, and they normally don't end up very well. I mean, I could even go forward and talk about what the genesis of the fund came about, which was what Keynes wrote about Germany, and which led to the creation of this. So, I mean, economies, they don't wake up, politicians, they don't wake up, and the economy doesn't develop a will, then unfortunately the economy has a sad way of enforcing that will. And Sri Lanka is seeing it, and I shudder to think of the day that it might happen to us. But I don't think our politicians are ready to take the warning. Hakan, your last words, please.
So both of you have spoken well on the macro. So let me be a bit more granular. What I'd like to see is that a full-blown crisis is avoided this year. We get the 31 billion. Fussy asked about the next 2 years. Next 2 years are pretty much looking the same, Fussy. About 35 billion is what we need in the next 2 years. I hope we can get our act together as we go into elections. And what I mean by that is that whichever government comes in has something to offer the people of Pakistan for the next 5 years at a granular level in the ministries that we talked about, whether it's through PIDE or other universities. We build some kind of capacity by the key policy actors that we've spoken about, and ensure that we move to a where we can get out of a perpetual dollar liquidity crunch, so that the boom and bust cycles go away and we are able to build this economy in the next 5 to 10 years.
Again, sorry, I don't buy this dollar liquidity crunch thing, so I have to come back on that. And Daniel raised the point about the 2000s, which is a very important point. I think part of it is manufactured because we don't understand the role of exchange rate policy. We've written a paper on this that, look, and we've had 6 currency crises, and all of them was a failure to understand what exchange rate policy is. We keep overvaluing the exchange rate, and we seem to be in love with an overvalued exchange rate, which our current finance minister is displaying. And we want to, if Hakan, I allow the exchange rate to depreciate, where is the liquidity crunch? Right? So the liquidity crunch only arises because we don't want the exchange rate to work. And 2, because we have our darling industries that we want to subsidize. And even though the fund pays a lot of lip service subsidies, those subsidies are never removed. The SROs, I was just looking at a chart of the SROs, they're still pretty much there, and at the same, well, they've declined a little bit, but not a lot. But they've declined because we have tried to shove under the carpet the regulatory duties and the surcharges, etc., because those are all kind of SROs too. So if you take all those into account, the SROs, the subsidies have increased. So I don't buy this liquidity crunch nonsense. I think, quite frankly, we have a solvency crisis. Face it. I know, Hakan, you hate to face it. We've had this debate many times, but I think it's worth having a debate in public too. So justify to me, how is it that we don't have a solvency crisis and we have a liquidity crisis? I think we have a deep solvency crisis. You tell me that 35 billion is the financing gap, okay? That, if you think about it, is 10% of GDP. So if you think about it, for the next 3 years, we add 10% of GDP to our debt figure. What kind of sustainability map are we looking at? Quickly.
So, Dr. Quickly, if you look at the 35 billion or so that I'm talking about, a big part of it is, of course, coming from CAD. So, as I said, if you start managing your economy properly, and I said CAD financing has to change. And if you fundamentally change that, you take about 12 billion out of this equation. So you end up again between 22 to 24 billion dollars, which for a country like Pakistan is easily financeable, and you can go through that. You can use solvency, which is a higher order word than what I use as always, dollar liquidity crunch. You can use, but here's the thing. So you bring your CAD down slowly to very, very manageable levels. Your financing needs, which is your amortization. Again, as I say, the good thing about the fund here is that it gives you these tables where you can find these numbers, which otherwise we talk without. So you are looking at about 22 to 24 billion dollar needs of amortization in the next 3 to 4 years, which for Pakistan, I don't think is a big deal.
No, but Hakan, how about this? What I'm suggesting to you, exchange rate, for example. If you let the exchange rate go, right? If you let the exchange rate go, maybe it'll go to 300, 400, whatever. Would that not solve a lot of the current account problem?
No, I don't think so, Dr. Dr. I think you're using just one instrument, right? A current account is also coming from what you're doing on the fiscal side. So it's not only the exchange rate that I have to manage my fiscal side. If I'm not managing my fiscal side, my CAD is not going to come down. So it is a number of instruments that you will use to make sure that your CAD is managed. Of course, the exchange rate, which you have used. You know, if you look at REAR, it kind of does tell us that you have used it. But you've not used your fiscal. Look at your fiscal for the past 3 years. It's 8% of GDP, Dr. Saab. How can you bring your CAD down if you're running in 8%? And that's just fiscal. Our favorite fiscal, which is the quasi-fiscal, is an addition, which is, of course, a liability of the government of Pakistan.
So let me turn to Khurram Saab again. Sorry, I said we should finish, but let's finish. But Khurram Saab, quickly. Let's say if the solution is, as Hakan says, let's do the fiscal as well as the current account. Can I say, if you put a halt, because I think this is also important, the PSTP is really destroying our politics. So can we put a halt on politics for the next, on the PSTP for the next 10 years? We say no more PSTP and let the exchange rate go to 400. Will that solve the problem, Khurram sir?
Yeah, Nadeem, I mean, look, hypothetically, we can discuss these things. I think on paper, we can sort of plot out what impact this would have. But I think realistically, I don't think that's possible. I think we'd have to also consider the losses that would mount as a result of projects that are, part of the way through implementation that would suddenly be halted.
So we can keep them. Let's say no new projects. We can keep those. Let's say no new projects for the next 10 years.
Hakan Saab, what do you think? No new projects for the next 10 years?
I think that we should do anyway. 8 trillion का खुरम साहब पीछे से आपके आ रहा है जो आपने
9 trillion बल्कि 9 हो गया
अच्छा सॉरी डॉक्टर साहब मोर अपडेट सो 9 ट्रिलियन का आ रहा है आपको 10 साल तो कोई प्रोजेक्ट करना ही नहीं चाहिए दैट इज वेरी सिंपल आपको ये भी सोचना है कि क्या बाकी ममालिक जो है अब अगेन डॉक्टर साहब लेट्स हैव अनदर सेशन के करंट अकाउंट की मैनेजमेंट कैसे होनी चाहिए फिस्कल की मैनेजमेंट बिकॉज हम इस रेल में जा रहे हैं करंट अकाउंट और फिस्कल की मैनेजमेंट के बारे में आपको आइडियाज अगर लाने तो आपको सोचना है कि क्या आपको पीएसडीपी को फिस्कल का पार्ट रखना चाहिए या आपको सोचना चाहिए कि ये डेवलपमेंट एक्सपेंस है और लेट्स से कि हम उसको बहुत अच्छा कर देते हैं आप प्रोजेक्ट से निकलकर आप वाकई ही प्रोग्राम्स में चले जाते हैं व्हिच आर एनहांसिंग द कैपेसिटी ऑफ द इकोनॉमी टू बी मोर प्रोडक्टिव सो यू हैव टू स्टार्ट थिंकिंग ऑन दोज लाइंस एंड ये तो अगर 9 ट्रिलियन का है तो फिर तो फ्रीज कर देना चाहिए और जब ये क्लियर होगा फिर दोबारा शुरू कर देंगे उसको
बिल्कुल सही जी खुरम साहब
I mean I think I would look to people like Hakan Saab for answers to these questions, Nadeem. I wouldn't really put myself in a position where I would answer them.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, sure, no new. I don't think Pakistan can afford to go on any kind of a spending spree over the next, foreseeable number of years. That much is evident.
Thank you, folks. Thank you very much. We had a very good discussion. Thank you, Hakan. Thank you, Khurram, for elevating the debate. Inshallah, PID will continue to do more of such debates to try and involve more and more of you, because I think we really need a country dialogue. I don't think these dialogues are useless, because they do create an environment of thought, and perhaps, maybe, a few decades later, politicians might begin to listen to us, because after all, when you think about it, the liberalization, privatization dialogue started off like this. I can take some credit. PID did start, Kamal Saab here. Many people started the dialogue on liberalization, privatization, etc. And now people have accepted that. So I think academic discussions do eventually lead to something. And yes, we should continue doing them. I urge all of you to join us in these. Let's try and open up this thing. It's our country. Hakan is right. It's our country. We have to take ownership. If we leave it to the IMF, then I was in many countries. I was on mission in many countries, mission chief, etc. I used to tell my friends there all the time that, look, guys, this is your country. I can only interfere so much. I can only write a report for my bosses. I can't write it for you. I can't fight your political battles for you. So I think that's a very important point to bear in mind. It's not the IMF's job. It's not the World Bank's job. But at the same time, I think it's their job also to involve academia. And we should try and carve out that relationship, but only if we do something. Thank you, folks. Thank you, Zargham, for joining us. All the best. Khuda Hafiz.